Female black pilot denied first-class seat by racist flight attendant. One call changed everything. The crisp morning air buzzed with the familiar hum of an airport coming to life. The first rays of the California sunrise bathed the tarmac at Los Angeles International Airport in gold, casting long shadows across the terminal's glass facade. Travelers hurried through security lines, clutching coffee cups and rolling their suitcases, preparing for the rush of another busy day in the sky. Among them stood Naomi Ellison, her posture tall, her stride confident. A woman of striking presence, she carried herself with the kind of poise and quiet authority that turned heads without effort. Her uniform, a pristine white pilot's shirt tucked neatly into tailored black slacks, golden stripes gleaming on her shoulders, left no room for doubt about her profession. In the crook of her arm rested her pilot's cap, its insignia a symbol of everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed to reach this moment. Yet, despite all she had achieved, she was about to be reminded that for some, her presence in this space was still something to be questioned. Naomi was scheduled to captain a transatlantic flight later that evening, but first she had to reposition from Los Angeles to New York. A thoughtful colleague had secured her a first-class seat, ensuring she could rest before the long haul ahead. She adjusted her grip on her cap, a small but familiar gesture that grounded her when the weight of expectations threatened to press too hard. Her journey to the skies had not been an easy one. As a child, she had spent countless afternoons pressed against the chain-link fence of a small municipal airport in Atlanta, watching planes carve their way through the heavens. Her father, a mechanic who spent his life tending to aircraft engines, would tell her, "One day, baby girl, you'll be the one flying these birds." He had been right. She had defied the odds, pushed past the barriers and taken her rightful place in the cockpit. But as she approached the check-in counter, she could feel something shift in the air, a tension subtle yet unmistakable. Behind the counter, a flight attendant with a neat blonde bun and a stiff name tag reading Heather glanced in Naomi's direction. Her gaze flicked over the uniform, her lips pressing into a thin line as her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Naomi had seen that look before. And she already knew, this was about to be anything but a routine check-in. Naomi took a steadying breath as she stepped forward, her instincts, honed from years of navigating both the skies and the complexities of human nature, telling her that this interaction would not be as simple as handing over her boarding pass. Heather's posture shifted slightly as Naomi approached, her shoulders stiffening in a way that spoke louder than words. Though she pasted on a polite, professional expression, there was a certain coolness in her demeanor, a forced civility that didn't quite mask the skepticism in her eyes. Naomi had encountered plenty of flight staff over the years, some warm and welcoming, others indifferent, but there was something in Heather's stare that sent a quiet warning through her veins. Still, Naomi remained composed, offering a courteous nod as she spoke. "Good morning. I'm on Flight 231 to New York. I'm a pilot repositioning for a transatlantic departure tonight." Heather's lips pressed into a firm line. She didn't respond immediately, instead tapping into her computer with deliberate slowness. When she finally spoke, her voice was clipped. "Name? Naomi Ellison." More typing. More hesitation. Naomi watched as Heather's eyes flicked over the screen, her brows tightening ever so slightly. "I see you're assigned to seat 1A. That's a first-class seat," Heather said, her tone carrying an edge that implied suspicion rather than confirmation. Her gaze lifted, pinning Naomi with a look that she had seen far too many times before, a blend of doubt and quiet hostility, as if the very idea of her presence in first class was an anomaly to be questioned. Naomi kept her voice even. "Yes, I'm aware. My airline booked the seat for me so I could rest before my next assignment." Heather exhaled sharply through her nose, eyes narrowing. "We don't typically allow non-revenue employees to just take first-class seats unless there's a special arrangement. Do you have proof of authorization?" The implication was clear. You don't belong here unless you can prove otherwise. Without missing a beat, Naomi reached into her neatly organized travel case, pulling out her official documentation. She slid it across the counter, tapping a manicured finger against the letter of authorization. "It's all here. I'm a pilot on duty travel, and this is standard policy." Heather took the documents with an air of reluctance, flipping through them with an almost performative impatience. A few feet away, another flight attendant, an older woman named Linda, paused in her own work, glancing up with a faintly concerned expression. Naomi caught the way Linda's gaze darted between her and Heather, as if she sensed the friction in the air. Heather made a show of sighing, then shoved the papers back across the counter. "Yeah, I'm not sure we can honor this. I'll have to move you to economy. If you want to sit in first class, You'll need to cover the fare difference yourself. A quiet heat flared in Naomi's chest. She had been patient. She had provided every necessary document. And yet, here she was, being told in no uncertain terms, that she didn't deserve the seat she had been assigned. She inhaled, steady and slow, before pulling out her airline ID and holding it up for Heather to see. With all due respect, I don't need to pay for anything. My airline has already taken care of it. Heather barely glanced at the ID before crossing her arms, her expression hard. And which airline do you supposedly work for? Naomi's grip on her pilot's cap tightened ever so slightly. She could feel the weight of Linda's gaze on her, the silent disapproval in the older woman's posture. There was no mistaking what was happening here. And Naomi wasn't about to let it slide. Heather's fingers drummed against the counter, her lips pressing into a thin, unimpressed line. And you're flying for which airline again? She asked, her tone laced with skepticism. Naomi met her gaze steadily and repeated the name of her airline, her voice calm but firm. Heather exhaled sharply, glancing back down at the documents as if hoping to find some inconsistency. She tapped her manicured nails against the desk, the rhythmic sound an unspoken display of irritation. I've never heard of them giving first-class seats to pilots unless they're high-ranking executives, she said, her voice slow, deliberate. Are you absolutely sure you're not mistaken about your seat assignment? Naomi felt her jaw tighten. She had dealt with dismissive attitudes before, but this was something more pointed, more deliberate. There's no mistake, she said evenly. Everything is in order. Heather let out a quiet snort and turned slightly toward her coworker, a younger man named Jason who was half distracted, sorting luggage tags. Without lowering her voice, she announced, "We've got a first-class claim from a commuter." The word dripped with condescension, and it was clear she had chosen it deliberately. I'm going to need some backup here. Naomi felt heat rise in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had learned long ago that some people were waiting for her to react, waiting for her to give them a reason to justify their assumptions. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. There's no need for backup, ma'am, Naomi said, her voice unwavering. I'm a pilot traveling under a reciprocal agreement between my airline and yours. I'm not some passenger hoping to sneak into first class. Heather's upper lip curled, a barely concealed smirk playing at the edges. I'll be the judge of that. Nearby, Linda finished assisting another passenger and turned toward them, her expression pinched with concern. She hesitated before speaking, clearly aware of the mounting tension. Heather, Linda said gently, maybe we should double-check her documentation or check with a supervisor. Heather waved a dismissive hand. I don't need a supervisor for this. I know exactly how these seat allocations work. Naomi exhaled slowly, maintaining her composure as she reached into her bag and placed her documents back on the counter. This time she included everything: her boarding pass, the seat confirmation email from her airline, and a printed copy of her travel itinerary. It's all there, she said simply. Her voice was measured, steady. Heather barely glanced at the papers before rolling her eyes. With a scoff, she shoved them back toward Naomi. This looks suspicious, she said, crossing her arms. And I don't feel comfortable upgrading you. Her voice hardened. You're not sitting in first class on my watch. A murmur rippled through the passengers waiting behind Naomi, who had been watching the exchange with growing interest. Some exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the tension. A few whispered among themselves. Others shifted impatiently, annoyed by the delay. Linda's voice cut through the moment, gentle but firm. Let's step aside and talk this through calmly. There's a line forming. Naomi could feel eyes on her. Some were sympathetic. Others were simply curious. She adjusted her grip on her pilot's cap, willing herself to stay calm. Because she wasn't backing down. Not today. A hushed tension settled over the line as passengers continued to check in, some pretending not to notice the exchange while others openly watched. Naomi felt her pulse steady, her years of training keeping her emotions in check even as frustration simmered beneath the surface. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to ensure the conversation remained between her and Heather. I'm sorry if there's any confusion, but I've followed every protocol. This seat was properly assigned to me, and I have the necessary documentation to prove it. Please check again. Heather, however, did not budge. If anything, her expression hardened, her stance shifting as though preparing for a standoff. I don't care what your story is, she said, her voice colder now, sharper. You can take a seat in economy or not fly at all. That's your choice. The casual dismissal in her tone stung, but Naomi refused to let it show. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest. Not just the inconvenience, not just the insult, but the sheer audacity of being treated as though she didn't belong. She had dealt with skepticism before, subtle doubt from instructors in flight school who questioned her capabilities, from peers who second-guessed her authority. But this was different. This was outright rejection in plain sight in broad daylight. Naomi took a slow, measured breath, centering herself before responding. "I'll wait for the supervisor," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm not giving up my seat without a legitimate reason." Heather's eyes flashed, but she simply let out an exasperated sigh. "Fine. Stand over there. I'll see if a supervisor can be bothered to deal with this." Naomi stepped aside, gripping her pilot's cap a little tighter, her expression composed despite the quiet rage boiling beneath the surface. From a few feet away, Linda cast her a small, apologetic nod, one that Naomi recognized instantly. It was the look of someone who knew injustice when they saw it but had neither the authority nor the courage to stop it. Naomi appreciated the silent acknowledgement but wished Linda had the power to override Heather's blatant obstruction. The terminal buzzed with its usual rhythm, passengers rolling their luggage, announcements crackling overhead, but for Naomi the minutes dragged by in agonizing slowness. She watched as other travelers checked in without issue, their transactions taking mere moments. Yet Heather never once looked in her direction again, making a pointed effort to act as though she wasn't even there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a man in his early 50s approached the counter, his brow creased in mild confusion. He was stocky, dressed in a slightly wrinkled uniform, and carried the air of someone who had been called in to handle a situation he didn't yet understand. His name tag read Mark Whitmore, shift supervisor. Heather leaned toward him immediately, speaking in hushed tones. From the corner of her eye, Naomi could see her gesturing vaguely in her direction, her mouth set in a firm line as she relayed her version of events. Mark's frown deepened as he listened, his gaze flicking briefly toward Naomi before returning to Heather. And in that moment Naomi knew. Whatever happened next would determine whether professionalism or prejudice would win the day. Mark's eyes flickered with something between curiosity and mild exasperation as he listened to Heather's hushed explanation. From Naomi's vantage point, it was clear she was framing the situation in whatever way best suited her, her hands gesturing sharply in Naomi's direction. Naomi remained composed, standing tall as Mark turned to her, his expression neutral but expectant. "Ma'am, can you explain the situation?" he asked, his tone more measured than Heather's had been. Naomi nodded, keeping her voice steady. "Certainly. I'm a pilot repositioning for a transatlantic flight later tonight. My airline booked me a first-class seat as part of a standard arrangement. I provided all necessary documentation, including my authorization letter, itinerary, and ID. However, I was told my seat wouldn't be honored." Mark listened carefully, occasionally glancing back at Heather as if assessing how much weight to give her version of events. Then he extended a hand toward Naomi's documents. She handed them over without hesitation. His brow furrowed slightly as he scanned each page, flipping through them methodically. The terminal noise hummed around them, passengers moving in steady waves, but for Naomi the moment stretched, waiting for his verdict. After a long pause, Mark exhaled. "Everything looks to be in order," he said, his voice neutral but firm. "There's no reason to deny you this seat. The reservation is valid." Heather's sharp intake of breath was immediate. "I told you it's suspicious," she snapped. "Since when do repositioning pilots get first-class perks on our airline? She doesn't even work for us." Mark sighed, his patience clearly wearing thin. "We have reciprocity agreements, Heather. You know that. If her airline booked the seat, we honor it. That's policy." Heather's gaze darkened as she turned back toward Naomi, her lips pressed so tightly together they nearly disappeared. "It doesn't feel right," she muttered. Naomi felt her fingers tighten around the edge of her cap, the weight of the moment pressing down. She had no interest in changing Heather's mind. People like her rarely saw reason when their bias had already been decided, but she would claim the seat she was rightfully given. Mark, sensing the rising tension, shifted his focus back to Naomi. "Let me print you a fresh boarding pass to avoid further issues." He tapped a few keys and within seconds the machine spit out a crisp new pass. He handed it to Naomi with an apologetic nod. "Apologies for the inconvenience. Enjoy your flight." Naomi took the boarding pass, offering a polite, professional nod. "Thank you." She turned to leave, eager to distance herself from the negativity, but the weight of Heather's burning glare followed her. Naomi didn't have to look back to know that this wasn't over. People like Heather never let things go easily. But Naomi? She wasn't about to back down. Naomi moved through security with ease this time, handing over her documents with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. A few TSA officers exchanged polite conversation, one even acknowledging her uniform with a nod of recognition. "Captain," he said with a smile. "Heading out on duty?" Naomi returned the smile, her tone professional but warm. "Later tonight, repositioning for now." The moment of casual respect was a welcome contrast to what she had just experienced, but as she made her way toward the gate, the knot in her stomach tightened. Then she saw her. Heather. Standing near the boarding counter, engaged in conversation with Jason, her smirk unmistakable. Naomi's heart sank. She had assumed, hoped, that Heather was part of the ground crew, someone she could leave behind along with the tension at check-in. But no, she was here. On this flight. Naomi lingered by a row of seats, keeping her expression neutral as she observed them. The massive terminal windows stretched beside her, the aircraft visible through the glass, its sleek exterior glinting under the afternoon sun. To any other traveler this was just another boarding process, just another flight. But for Naomi, there was an undeniable tension in the air, an undercurrent of unfinished business. Heather laughed lightly at something Jason said, her arms folded, her stance casual, but Naomi recognized the body language for what it was, a calculated display of dominance. They hadn't noticed her yet, but she had no doubt that when they did, their attitude wouldn't be any different from before. Naomi inhaled slowly, centering herself. She reminded herself that professionalism was her responsibility, no matter the circumstances. That had always been the unspoken rule. Black pilots, female pilots, anyone who had to work twice as hard to be here knew it well. She couldn't afford to react emotionally, even when faced with open hostility. Still, there were limits. A flight attendant refusing to honor a ticket was one thing. A flight attendant denying a repositioning pilot their legally booked seat was something else entirely. This wasn't just rudeness, it was a breach of professionalism, one that could carry real consequences. As passengers began to gather around the gate, Naomi's mind flicked ahead to the long-haul flight she was meant to captain later that night. If this situation drained her any further, if she boarded this plane and found herself facing yet another unnecessary battle, would she be too exhausted to command the transatlantic journey safely? Would she have to call her airline and tell them to scramble for a replacement? The thought alone made her jaw tighten. She hated letting her colleagues down. She had worked too hard to earn their trust, their respect. And yet, here she was, being forced into another exhausting confrontation before she even stepped on board. She caught her own reflection in the terminal glass, poised, composed, but with a flicker of weariness beneath the surface. Flying had always meant freedom to her. Progress. The ability to soar above the limitations others had tried to place on her. And yet, prejudice remained an anchor, trying to drag her back down. She exhaled, slow and steady. Then the boarding announcement crackled through the speakers. Passengers rose to their feet, clutching their tickets, moving toward the gate in a steady, organized line. Naomi squared her shoulders and picked up her bag. One way or another she was getting on that plane. And she wasn't about to let anyone stop her. Naomi waited until the final call for first-class passengers before making her way to the gate. She wasn't interested in drawing any more attention than necessary, just slipping into her seat, settling in, and avoiding any further conflict. But, of course, Heather was stationed at the boarding gate, scanning tickets. Naomi approached calmly, keeping her posture relaxed, her expression neutral. She gave a polite nod, extending her boarding pass without a word. Heather took it without acknowledging the gesture, her fingers tightening around the paper as she stared at the name printed on it. For a moment, Naomi thought she might tear it in half, given the way her hand twitched. Instead, Heather's lips curled into a smirk. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Naomi met her gaze steadily, refusing to react. "Thank you," she replied, her tone cool but unwavering. She took back the boarding pass and strode onto the jet bridge, inhaling deeply as she walked. Every part of her wanted to let the frustration settle into her chest, to let the weight of the moment drag her down. But she wouldn't. Stepping onto the aircraft, she quickly located seat 1A, a plush first-class seat near the window. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment, then settled in, pressing her back into the leather and exhaling slowly. The extra space was a luxury, one she appreciated more now than ever. She considered ordering a drink but thought better of it, best to keep things simple. Water. Maybe coffee once they were in the air. As passengers continued boarding, she caught a few curious glances from those in first class. An older gentleman in a tweed blazer offered a polite nod. A young woman in business attire gave her a brief but warm smile. Naomi returned both gestures, relieved to see that, at least here, there were still people who didn't immediately question her presence. Soon, the cabin crew began their routine safety preparations. Linda and Jason moved efficiently through their tasks, but Naomi couldn't help but notice Heather lingering nearby, her gaze flicking toward her far too often, her expression unreadable but undeniably calculated. She wasn't done yet. Naomi could feel it. At one point, Linda approached her row, offering a warm, professional smile. "Welcome aboard, Captain Ellison. Can I get you something before takeoff?" Naomi hesitated, glancing subtly around the cabin before answering. "Just water, please." Linda nodded, her tone reassuring. "Of course." Within moments she returned with a small bottle and a plastic cup, setting them on Naomi's tray table with a quiet kindness that didn't go unnoticed. "Thank you," Naomi said, appreciating the gesture more than she let on. Linda gave a small nod before moving on, tending to other passengers. Naomi wrapped her fingers around the cool bottle, grounding herself in the simple act of unscrewing the cap. Across the aisle, Heather stood near the galley, pretending to check inventory, but Naomi knew better. Heather was watching her. Waiting. And Naomi had no doubt, this wasn't over yet. Naomi leaned back slightly, feeling the subtle vibrations of the aircraft as it pushed back from the gate. The familiar hum of the engines settling into a steady rhythm usually brought her a sense of calm, a reminder of why she loved flying. But today the tension still clung to her like a second skin. She couldn't help but wonder how Linda and Heather ended up working together. Their approaches to professionalism couldn't have been more different. One exuded quiet competence and kindness, the other operated with hostility barely hidden beneath a thin veil of protocol. It was a dynamic Naomi had seen before, the kind where good people were often forced to stand beside those who had no business being in positions of authority. As the plane taxied, Heather began moving through the aisle, performing her final compliance checks. Naomi kept her focus forward, hoping for a moment of peace, but she could sense Heather slowing as she neared her row. Then, as expected, she stopped. Her voice, deliberately loud enough for passengers nearby to hear, cut through the cabin. "Seatbelt on?" Naomi calmly lifted the edge of her uniform jacket, revealing the securely fastened belt across her lap. "Yes." Heather gave a curt nod, her expression unreadable, then continued down the aisle as though nothing had happened. Naomi exhaled quietly. It was a minor interaction, but she recognized it for what it was. Another attempt at control, a subtle reminder that Heather wasn't done yet. The plane rolled onto the runway, engines spooling up, the sheer force pressing Naomi back into her seat as they surged into the sky. The ascent was smooth, the aircraft climbing effortlessly through the bright blue morning. For a brief moment, Naomi allowed herself to let go, to enjoy the flight from a passenger's perspective rather than a pilot's. There was something humbling about being on this side of the cockpit door, watching the world fall away beneath her feet without being the one guiding the controls. Still, she didn't let her guard down. The seatbelt sign remained on as the captain announced their estimated cruising altitude and flight duration. A few minutes later, the light flicked off, and the flight attendants sprang into action. Jason disappeared behind the curtain, likely preparing beverages. Linda, moving with effortless grace, began distributing hot towels to first-class passengers. Meanwhile, Heather lingered near the galley, her movements deliberate, her attention focused elsewhere. Naomi already knew what was coming before it happened. Heather approached her row, her presence unmistakable even before she spoke. "Ma'am," she said, her voice laced with feigned politeness. "I need to see your boarding pass again." Naomi slowly turned her head, arching a brow. "You already scanned it at the door," she said evenly. Heather tilted her head slightly, as if considering how much she wanted to push the issue. "I'd like to verify something. Your name and seat number, please." Naomi didn't miss the way a few nearby passengers glanced toward them, sensing the tension. She could have refused. She could have asked for a legitimate reason. But instead, she reached into her jacket pocket and handed over the boarding pass without a word. Heather took her time flipping it over, inspecting it as though expecting to find something, anything, out of place. Naomi watched as her eyes scanned the details, her fingers tapping the edge of the paper. Eventually, Heather exhaled sharply through her nose, clearly finding nothing amiss. She handed it back, her expression stiff. "Thank you," she muttered, her tone making it sound like anything but gratitude. Naomi accepted the pass with a small nod, then turned her attention back to the window. Heather lingered for half a second longer than necessary before walking away. Naomi didn't need to look back to know. This wasn't over. Not yet. Across the aisle, an older woman with soft gray curls and a gentle presence, Eleanor, leaned slightly toward Naomi, her eyes kind. "I saw what happened at the gate," she whispered, voice low enough to keep it between them. "Don't let it ruin your flight." Naomi felt a small wave of gratitude at the unexpected support. She gave Eleanor a polite nod. "Thank you," she murmured back, appreciating the quiet solidarity. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady rhythmic sound that usually lulled Naomi into a state of ease. The mild turbulence caused the seatbelt sign to flicker back on occasionally, but overall, the flight was smooth. She closed her eyes, hoping to rest her mind, to recharge before the long-haul journey awaiting her later that night. But the weight of unwanted attention kept pulling her back. No matter how much she tried to ignore it, she could feel Heather's eyes on her. Every time she shifted slightly or adjusted her seat, Naomi caught the subtle glances. It was like Heather was waiting, watching, for some excuse, some moment to justify her behavior. Then, just as Naomi was about to shake the feeling and settle in, she caught snippets of hushed voices coming from the galley nearby. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but in the small, contained space of the first-class cabin, it was impossible not to hear. "I don't know why the supervisor let her stay," Heather muttered, irritation thick in her voice. Jason's reply was quieter, more hesitant. "She had all the right paperwork. It's not really worth arguing over." Heather's response was sharper. "Not worth it for you maybe, but I'm not going to be made a fool of. Let her try something, I'll be watching." Naomi's fingers curled slightly against her lap. Her pulse quickened, but not from anger. She had learned long ago that reacting emotionally was exactly what people like Heather wanted. No, this was something different. It was the sharp realization that Heather wasn't just being difficult. She wasn't just acting out of spite. She was looking for an opportunity, waiting for a reason to escalate things further. Naomi took a slow breath, steadying herself. She had no intention of giving Heather that satisfaction. A moment later, Linda made her way through the first-class cabin, taking meal orders. She stopped beside Naomi's seat, her expression warm but subtly weary. "Would you like chicken or pasta for lunch, Captain Ellison?" Naomi met her gaze, reading the unspoken apology in the older woman's eyes. "Chicken, please," she replied softly, keeping her voice steady. Linda nodded, jotting it down on her notepad before pausing briefly. Then, with quiet sincerity, she added, "I'm sorry if this flight hasn't been a pleasant experience so far. I hope the rest is smoother." Her words were carefully chosen, professional but deliberate. Naomi held her gaze for a beat, understanding the underlying message. "I appreciate that," she said, offering a small but genuine smile. Linda moved on, continuing to take orders from other passengers. For the first time since boarding, a flicker of relief passed through Naomi. At least one person on this crew understood what was happening. And that alone was enough to remind her. She wasn't alone in this. Linda's quiet acknowledgement of the situation had been a small but meaningful gesture, just enough to steady Naomi's resolve. She had no intention of escalating things, no desire to create unnecessary conflict. She would handle this professionally. But as if to test that resolve, Heather returned. This time, she carried a tray of drinks, her expression noticeably colder than before. Naomi observed as she moved through the cabin, distributing beverages with automatic efficiency. When she reached seat 1B, she placed a glass of water down with a polite nod, then turned abruptly toward Naomi. She didn't offer a drink. Didn't even pretend to. Instead, she stood there staring. Naomi raised a hand slightly, a simple gesture to indicate that she was fine. She didn't need anything. Heather ignored the silent exchange, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly before she spoke. "Everything okay here?" The question was laced with an unmistakable edge, as if daring Naomi to challenge her. Naomi met her gaze, unwavering. "All good." For a moment, Heather lingered as though waiting for something, for Naomi to push back, to react, to give her a reason. But Naomi didn't. After a few more tense seconds, Heather pivoted sharply and continued down the aisle, her presence leaving behind a faint chill in the air. Naomi let out a slow breath, keeping her expression neutral as she mentally logged the interaction. Every remark, every omission, every pointed action. She noted them all, filing them away in case she needed to escalate this later. Lunch arrived soon after, served by Linda with the same quiet professionalism she had shown earlier. The meal was standard fare, simple, unremarkable, but Naomi barely tasted it. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the past few hours. Was there more to Heather's hostility? Was this personal, or was it just as straightforward as it seemed? Did she see a black woman in a first-class seat in a pilot's uniform, and decide that didn't sit right with her? The weight of that possibility settled in Naomi's chest, not as a surprise, but as an exhaustion she knew all too well. After lunch, the cabin settled into a lull. Some passengers dozed off, others busied themselves with the in-flight entertainment. Naomi allowed herself to rest, but only lightly. Her awareness remained heightened, attuned to every movement in her periphery. She reminded herself of the contacts in her phone, colleagues, industry leaders, people who would be very interested to hear about this if it came to that. Eventually, the seatbelt sign illuminated once more, and the captain's voice came over the speakers, announcing the beginning of their descent. Naomi adjusted her posture, fastening her seatbelt as the flight attendants moved about the cabin, tidying up and preparing for landing. Heather once again was watching. This time, her expression had darkened, her gaze scanning Naomi's seat with something close to brooding calculation. And Naomi knew, this wasn't over yet. Heather stood near Naomi's seat, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable, but Naomi knew exactly what was coming. She was waiting. For what? Naomi wasn't sure, but it was clear Heather wasn't finished with her. The aircraft touched down smoothly, rolling along the runway before taxiing toward the gate. Naomi felt a small wave of relief. She would be off this plane soon, leaving the tension behind. Or so she thought. The seatbelt sign clicked off, and just as passengers began shifting to retrieve their belongings, Heather stepped forward. "Ma'am," she said, her voice deliberately raised just enough for the other first-class passengers to hear, "I need you to remain seated until everyone else has disembarked. There's a matter I need to discuss with you." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. "What matter?" she asked evenly. Heather folded her arms. "It's private," she replied with forced civility. "Just remain in your seat." A flicker of movement across the aisle caught Naomi's eye. Eleanor, the older woman who had spoken to her earlier, was watching with barely concealed disapproval. Another passenger shook his head in disbelief. Naomi had no desire to escalate things, not here, not now. So she simply said, "All right." The other passengers gathered their belongings, some stealing glances in Naomi's direction as they exited. A few offered her sympathetic looks, silently acknowledging the absurdity of what was happening. Linda hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable, while Jason busied himself with the cabin door, doing his best to stay out of it. Finally, the last passenger exited, leaving the cabin nearly empty. Naomi rose, adjusting her uniform with quiet composure, and retrieved her carry-on from the overhead bin. Heather, standing firm in the aisle, did not move. Naomi met her gaze coolly. "All right. I stayed behind. What do you need to discuss?" Heather's lips pursed. "I want an explanation." Naomi arched a brow. "An explanation for what?" Heather crossed her arms. "How you ended up here," she said, her voice laced with challenge. "And why you think you have the right to sit in this seat." A flicker of heat rose in Naomi's chest, but she remained outwardly calm. Behind Heather, Linda cleared her throat sharply. "Heather, let's not do this," she said firmly. Heather spun toward her. "Stay out of it," she snapped. Naomi didn't flinch. She had dealt with this kind of behavior before, people who thrived on their own sense of power, who pushed just far enough to see how much they could get away with. "I don't owe you any explanation beyond what I've already given," Naomi said, her voice steady. "I provided my paperwork. The supervisor validated it." Heather scoffed. "That supervisor didn't know what he was doing. I think you pulled some strings. I don't know who you think you are, but if you're misrepresenting yourself as a pilot..." Naomi's patience snapped. Her eyes locked onto Heather's with an intensity that cut through the air like a blade. "I'm not misrepresenting anything," she said, her voice low and controlled. Heather lifted her chin defiantly. "Then explain yourself." Linda stepped forward, placing a firm but gentle hand on Heather's arm. "That's enough," she said. "You're out of line. Captain Ellison has every right to be here. This flight is over." Heather's jaw tightened, but for the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossed her face. Naomi simply adjusted the strap of her bag, her posture unwavering. She wasn't going to be intimidated. Not now. Not ever. Heather jerked her arm free from Linda's grasp, eyes flashing with indignation. "Don't touch me," she snapped. "I'm just doing my job." Naomi had reached her limit. Without another word, she reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. "I'll be contacting customer relations," she said calmly. "And if you need verification, I'll also call my airline scheduling department. They can confirm everything right now." For a split second, Naomi thought Heather might physically block her path. The tension between them was palpable, and Heather's expression twisted with something ugly, frustration, resentment, maybe even panic. But then, slowly Heather stepped aside, her glare sharp enough to cut glass. Naomi walked past her without hesitation, her steps measured, controlled. Linda trailed behind her, ready to intervene if necessary, though Naomi knew that at this point, there was nothing left to say. At the aircraft doorway, Jason stood awkwardly, shifting his weight from foot to foot. His expression was unreadable, but Naomi didn't linger long enough to decipher it. She simply gave him a curt nod and exited the plane. Stepping onto the jet bridge, she felt her chest rise with a slow, controlled inhale. She wasn't shaken, she refused to be, but the frustration still simmered beneath the surface. At the end of the jet bridge, a gate agent stood near the counter, her eyes widening slightly at Naomi's expression. Naomi didn't explain. Didn't need to. "Where's the airline lounge?" she asked, her voice even. The agent quickly pointed her in the right direction. "Down that hall to the right." "Thanks." Naomi walked with purpose, her grip tightening on the handle of her carry-on. The moment she reached the lounge, she loosened the top button of her uniform shirt, exhaling deeply as she finally allowed herself to process everything that had happened. Her heart was still pounding, not out of fear but out of sheer exhaustion. The emotional strain, the blatant hostility, the way Heather had tried to strip her of her professionalism in front of an entire cabin of passengers, it all settled on her shoulders like an invisible weight. She found a quiet corner, sank into a chair and took out her phone. This wasn't just about principle anymore. She needed to call her airline, not only to confirm her arrival but to make sure they were aware that her much-needed rest had been disrupted by an unnecessary and entirely avoidable confrontation. As she prepared to dial, she realized her hands were trembling slightly. Naomi clenched them into fists, took a deep breath and steadied herself. Then she made the call. "Pilot scheduling," came a crisp voice on the other end. "This is Naomi Ellison, employee ID 67432. I've arrived in New York for my transatlantic flight tonight, but I need to report an incident that occurred on my inbound flight." She relayed the details in a measured, professional tone, keeping her emotions in check. On the other end, the scheduling coordinator, Elaine, listened intently. Then, after a short silence, her voice hardened with quiet disapproval. "Naomi, that's unacceptable. I'm so sorry you had to deal with that. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Naomi replied, pressing her fingertips to her temple. "Just a bit rattled. I'll be ready for my flight, but I want this documented. That crew member's behavior was completely out of line." Elaine didn't hesitate. "Consider it handled." And for the first time since stepping onto that plane, Naomi felt the slightest hint of relief. Elaine's question lingered in Naomi's mind. "Do you want to speak to management about filing a formal complaint?" She hesitated for only a moment before nodding to herself. "I will. But let's do it after my flight," she said. "I don't want to get distracted right now, just make a note that I'll be reaching out." Elaine's voice remained steady. "Of course. Take your time. Get some rest. We need you in top form." Naomi thanked her and ended the call, exhaling slowly. A small wave of relief washed over her, not because the situation was over, but because she knew she had the full backing of her airline. She leaned back in the lounge chair, closing her eyes briefly, willing herself to let go of the tension. Her transatlantic flight wasn't until late evening, which meant she had a few hours to collect herself. The thought of booking a hotel room crossed her mind, but she dismissed it just as quickly. The less she moved around the airport, the better. Still, the frustration gnawed at her. She couldn't let this slide. If Heather had done this to her, a uniformed, credentialed pilot with the full support of her airline, what was stopping her from doing it to another passenger? Someone without the authority, without the resources, without the means to push back? That thought settled deep in Naomi's chest, anger simmering just beneath the surface. She didn't want to fight this battle, but the reality was she had a responsibility to hold Heather accountable. She sighed, reaching for a cup of tea a lounge attendant had placed nearby. The warmth helped ground her, at least momentarily. She picked up a newspaper from the side table and skimmed the headlines, trying to refocus her mind. Then her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Hello, Captain Ellison. This is Linda from your flight. I hope I'm not intruding. I just wanted to say I'm sorry again for what happened. I found your number through the flight roster. If you need any statement from me or help verifying what happened, let me know." Naomi's chest tightened with unexpected gratitude. She quickly typed back, "Thank you, Linda. I truly appreciate your kindness. I may need your testimony if I file a complaint." The reply came almost immediately. "Of course. I'm here to help." Naomi set her phone down, feeling a renewed sense of calm settle over her. At least one person on that crew had the integrity to step forward. She knew now, without a doubt, she would be filing a formal complaint. She took out a notepad and jotted down key details, ensuring she wouldn't forget anything when she spoke to management. The act of organizing her thoughts, methodically laying out the facts, helped her regain a sense of control. Finally, the time came to leave the lounge and head to the crew area for her transatlantic assignment. Naomi stood, rolling her shoulders back as she gathered her things. She had a job to do. And when it was over, she would make sure Heather answered for what she had done. Stepping into the crew briefing room, Naomi immediately felt the familiar sense of purpose settle over her. The structured routine of pre-flight preparations always had a way of grounding her, reminding her why she did this work. She greeted the rest of the cockpit crew with an easy confidence, slipping into the role of captain as she reviewed flight plans, checked weather patterns, and ensured all logs were up to date. The atmosphere was warm and professional, just as it should be. Her first officer, Ethan, a sharp but easygoing pilot in his early 30s, leaned against the planning table and glanced at her. "Did you reposition from another city today?" he asked. Naomi nodded. "Yeah, short hop over from LA," she said simply, offering nothing more. Ethan didn't press and she was grateful. The flight to London was smooth. The cockpit glowed softly in the night, the quiet hum of instruments creating a familiar rhythm that steadied Naomi's thoughts. As she guided the aircraft across the Atlantic, she focused entirely on the flight, on the responsibility of ensuring hundreds of passengers reached their destination safely. By the time they touched down, a deep sense of accomplishment settled over her. And yet, she hadn't forgotten. Not what had happened. Not what needed to be done. The next day, airline headquarters. Back at the airline offices the following morning, Naomi wasted no time. The moment she had completed her post-flight debrief, she requested a meeting with her direct manager, Diane Reynolds, a seasoned, sharp-witted woman in her 50s known for her no-nonsense approach. Standing outside Diane's office, Naomi took a steadying breath before knocking. "Come in," Diane's voice called out. Naomi stepped inside. Diane glanced up from her desk, setting aside a stack of reports. "Captain Ellison," she greeted, giving her a once-over. "How was your flight?" "It went well," Naomi replied, closing the door behind her. Then, after a brief pause, she added, "But something happened on my repositioning flight yesterday." Diane's brow furrowed slightly, her expression sharpening. Naomi didn't hesitate. She laid out the full story, the blatant hostility, the repeated harassment, the final attempt to intimidate her into staying behind after landing. Diane listened without interruption, her expression darkening with every detail. When Naomi finished, the silence in the room felt heavy. "That," Diane said finally, her voice tight with controlled anger, "is completely unacceptable." She leaned forward, her eyes sharp with intent. "Do you have the flight details? The crew member's name?" Naomi reached into her bag and placed the boarding pass on Diane's desk. "Her name is Heather," she said. "I also have a witness. One of the flight attendants, Linda, reached out to me after the flight and offered to provide a statement." Diane didn't waste a second. "I'm escalating this immediately." She picked up the boarding pass, tapping it against the desk. "Would you be willing to submit a formal written statement?" Naomi met her gaze without hesitation. Absolutely. She wasn't going to let this slide. And now she knew, neither was Diane. "Absolutely," Naomi said without hesitation, feeling a deep sense of relief. "Then put it in writing and send it to me," Diane instructed, her tone sharp with purpose. "I'll also request a statement from Linda. If that flight attendant acted out of racial bias or was simply abusing her authority, there will be serious consequences." She scribbled a few quick notes on her notepad before looking back up at Naomi. "I'm forwarding this to their corporate office. They claim to uphold the same zero-tolerance policies we do, so we'll see how they respond." Naomi exhaled, feeling a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged begin to lift. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I didn't want to make a bigger deal out of this than necessary, but the way she treated me was completely unprofessional." Diane nodded firmly. "This is a big deal. And I promise you, Naomi, I won't let this go unnoticed." Naomi thanked her again and left the office, but the tension didn't fully dissipate. For the next 2 days she went about her scheduled flights, focusing on her duties as best as she could, but a quiet sense of anticipation lingered. Would the airline in question take this seriously? Or would they try to bury it under bureaucratic excuses? Then an email arrived. It was from Linda, a concise but thorough account of everything she had witnessed, detailing how Heather had repeatedly questioned Naomi's credentials and subjected her to undue scrutiny. Naomi read through it carefully, grateful for Linda's honesty. At the end of the week her phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number, but she recognized the area code. "Hello, this is Captain Ellison," she answered. A professional yet measured voice responded. "Captain Ellison, this is Carmen Rodriguez, a representative from the airline's HR department. We've completed our initial review and spoken to the crew involved. On behalf of the airline, I want to sincerely apologize for the way you were treated." Naomi listened, her grip tightening slightly around her phone. Carmen continued, her tone firm but controlled. "We take these matters very seriously. I've reviewed multiple statements from witnesses, and we will be taking disciplinary action against the individuals responsible. However, before we move forward, I'd like to hear directly from you. Is there anything else you feel we should know?" Naomi took a deep breath. She walked through the incident once again, ensuring that every detail was clear. She didn't embellish, didn't exaggerate, just laid out the facts exactly as they had happened. Carmen listened intently, occasionally making notes but never interrupting. When Naomi finished, the HR representative reiterated the airline's zero-tolerance stance on discrimination and assured her that a formal internal review was in its final stages. Naomi ended the call feeling cautiously optimistic. She had been in the industry long enough to know that apologies were easy to give. Real accountability, however, was much rarer. But this time something felt different. The very next day an email landed in her inbox. And in bold, formal text, it confirmed what she hadn't dared to fully expect. Heather had been terminated. Not just her, Jason, along with Mark, the shift supervisor who had initially downplayed the incident, had also lost their positions. Naomi's eyes scanned the email, reading it twice to fully absorb the gravity of what had happened. Subject: Outcome of Internal Review, Flight 231. Dear Captain Ellison, thank you for your patience as we reviewed the incident on your repositioning flight. After conducting a thorough investigation and speaking with multiple witnesses, our management has determined that the actions of the flight attendant and the supporting staff violated our standards of respect, professionalism, and compliance with airline policies. As a result, we have made the decision to terminate their employment effective immediately. We deeply regret that you were subjected to such treatment and appreciate your professionalism throughout this process. Sincerely, Corporate Affairs. Airline name. Naomi exhaled slowly, staring at the screen for a long moment. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed that Heather might receive a suspension, maybe mandatory retraining. But an outright termination? And not just her, multiple staff members. The airline clearly wanted to make a statement. She forwarded the email to Diane Reynolds, who responded almost immediately. "I'm glad they acted swiftly. You deserve better, Naomi." Sitting in her apartment that night, Naomi stared out at the New York skyline, the city lights casting a quiet glow beyond her window. Part of her felt vindicated. This wasn't just about her, it was about setting a precedent. About proving that blatant discrimination had consequences. But another part of her felt a quiet, complicated sadness. She had never wanted to see anyone lose their job. But at the same time, no one should have to endure what she did. Her mind drifted to the obstacles she had faced throughout her career, the skeptical glances during training, the whispered comments behind her back, the moments of disbelief when she stepped into the cockpit for the first time in front of a crew who had assumed someone else was in charge. This wasn't just her fight. It was for every little girl standing behind an airport fence, watching planes take off and daring to dream that one day they could be in the pilot's seat. Moving forward, the days passed and Naomi focused on her work. She flew routes across continents, embracing the rhythm of her job, finding peace in the steady hum of the aircraft. That moment of liftoff, when the plane defied gravity, was always a reminder of why she pursued this career. In those moments, prejudice felt small. But the airline that had wronged her? They weren't done dealing with the fallout. Because soon, the media found out. The story didn't stay quiet for long. A few days after Naomi received the email about the terminations, the media got wind of it. An anonymous source had leaked the details: how a flight attendant was fired for racial bias against a black female pilot, how the airline had been forced to act after an internal investigation. Then the call started. Naomi's phone buzzed constantly with inquiries from reporters, all wanting an exclusive, all eager to put her name in the headlines. She declined most of them. She had no desire to become a public figure over a single ugly incident. But she made one exception. A respected aviation magazine reached out, not for gossip, but to discuss the broader issue of bias in the airline industry. That, Naomi felt, was worth addressing. In the interview, she spoke diplomatically. She didn't name names, didn't focus on the specific people involved. Instead, she emphasized the bigger picture. The cockpit is a place for skill and discipline, she said. Your background should never overshadow your qualifications. I hope that by addressing incidents like this, we can move closer to an aviation culture where every pilot, and every passenger, feels respected. The article gained traction. It circulated widely among pilots, flight crews, and industry professionals. While Naomi hadn't sought attention, she received an outpouring of supportive messages. From fellow pilots, from flight attendants who had faced their own struggles, from people who had witnessed or experienced workplace discrimination firsthand. She realized that, in speaking up, she hadn't just told her story. She had given others a voice. A message from Linda. Meanwhile, one message stood out among the rest. It was from Linda, the flight attendant who had supported her. I resigned from that airline after what happened. I realized I couldn't stay. But I've got a new job lined up with a regional carrier. Hope our paths cross again someday. Naomi felt an unexpected pang of guilt. Linda had done nothing wrong, yet she was the one who had felt compelled to leave. She quickly wrote back. Congratulations, Linda. I'm grateful for your honesty and integrity. Wishing you the best in your new role. Linda's response was immediate. No regrets. It was my decision. I just couldn't stay in an environment where that kind of behavior was tolerated. I needed a fresh start. Naomi understood that all too well. Life moves forward. Over the next month, Naomi settled back into her routine. Flight rosters, pre-flight checklists, long-haul routes across the world. On her days off, she spent time reading, going for long runs, staying sharp. Occasionally, her thoughts drifted back to Heather. What was she doing now? Did she regret what had happened? Or did she blame Naomi entirely? She would probably never know. And honestly, she didn't need to. A call from her father. One afternoon, as she prepared for a short-haul flight, her phone rang. She smiled when she saw the caller ID. Her father, Roland. She answered, already knowing what was coming. And as always, his voice was warm. Naomi, I saw the article. She exhaled, leaning against the counter, ready for the conversation that was about to unfold. Naomi smiled as she answered the call, recognizing the deep, familiar voice on the other end. Her father, Roland Ellison, was calling from Atlanta, Georgia. His voice had that same steady warmth she had always known, like a deep hum from an old, reliable engine. Naomi, I saw something on the news about a pilot standing up to discrimination. Sounded like you. Am I right? Naomi chuckled softly, shaking her head. Guilty? Roland let out a thoughtful hum. I'm proud of you. You've always had that quiet strength. I still remember taking you to that little airport when you were a kid. You'd watch the planes take off and say, someday that'll be me. Her chest tightened slightly with emotion. Yeah, Dad. You were right. Roland exhaled. I guess I never thought about the kind of challenges you'd face outside the cockpit. But I should have known. Naomi swallowed the lump in her throat, feeling the depth of his words settle in. Thanks, Dad. That means a lot. They talked for a while, about home, about how the small regional airport she had grown up around was now handling more commercial flights, about Roland's health, about the changing world around them. Despite everything, Naomi felt grateful. Her father had always been her rock, his quiet perseverance shaping the way she carried herself, the way she handled adversity. An unexpected letter. A few days later, Naomi checked her mail and found an unexpected envelope. The sender? The CEO of the airline that had employed Heather. Naomi hesitated before carefully opening it, her eyes scanning the letter inside. Dear Captain Ellison, I want to personally apologize for the ordeal you experienced. As the CEO of this company, I take full responsibility for the actions of our employees. We hold ourselves to the highest standards of professionalism and respect for all passengers and crew members, regardless of race, profession, or affiliation. What you experienced was a clear violation of our core values. While I know that we cannot undo the harm that was caused, I want to assure you that we have taken measurable steps to improve our training programs, strengthen our anti-discrimination policies, and enforce greater accountability among our staff. As a gesture of goodwill, We would like to offer you a lifetime pass to fly with our airline, wherever we operate, in the hope that we may one day regain your trust. Sincerely, CEO's name. Naomi read the letter twice. A lifetime pass? She knew a PR move when she saw one. It was a remarkable offer, yes, but one made not just out of goodwill but necessity. Still, the gesture held weight. She set the letter down on her coffee table, staring at it for a long moment. Would she ever use it? She didn't know. For now she would let it sit. A new flight, a new day. The next morning, Naomi was scheduled for a flight to the West Coast. A new crew. A new route. A fresh slate. And she was ready. Because no matter what had happened, she wasn't stopping now. Arriving at the airport, Naomi moved through the usual security lines with practiced ease, exchanging brief greetings with the staff at her airline's check-in counters. Despite everything, she still felt that sense of belonging, a feeling that had been momentarily tarnished by Heather's actions, but never truly diminished. Yet as she walked through the terminal, she noticed something new. People recognized her. Some offered polite nods of acknowledgement, silent gestures of support. Others simply watched her in quiet curiosity, likely connecting her to the recent media coverage. Naomi kept her posture steady, her stride measured. She reminded herself she had never sought attention. Only fairness. Once in the cockpit, she settled into her routine with her first officer, double-checking the aircraft, reviewing their flight plan and preparing for departure. And as the plane soared into the sky, Naomi felt it again, that thrill. That sense of control, of purpose. Here at 35,000 feet, only skill mattered. The aircraft didn't care about bias. The flight plan didn't account for prejudice. What mattered was her ability to command this machine, to guide it across the sky, carrying hundreds of passengers safely to their destination. In this space, discrimination had no place. A moment of meaning. After landing on the West Coast and completing a smooth taxi to the gate, Naomi emerged from the cockpit. She stood by the flight deck door, greeting passengers as they exited. Then an older black gentleman paused. He looked at her for a moment, a warm, knowing smile on his face. "I read about you," he said quietly. "Thank you for what you did." Naomi felt something shift in her chest. "My grandson wants to be a pilot," he continued. "And it's good to see someone who looks like him up front." A wave of warmth spread through Naomi's heart. She returned his smile. "Tell him he can do anything he sets his mind to." The man's eyes sparkled. "I will." Then he nodded and walked on, disappearing into the terminal. That moment stayed with her. It reaffirmed why she had spoken up. Why it had mattered. Reflection. Later that night, back in her hotel room, Naomi sat near the window looking out over the city. She let herself reflect on everything that had happened. One phone call to the right person. The support of her manager. The statement from Linda. Each step had led to real action, not just for herself but for something bigger. The story had been told. The consequences had followed. And now, a new conversation had begun. More and more stories like hers were surfacing. Pilots, flight attendants, and passengers stepping forward, speaking about their own experiences with bias in aviation. This wasn't just about one flight, one airline, or one incident. It was part of a bigger fight, for dignity, for representation, for change. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi felt hope. Real hope. That progress wasn't just possible. It was happening. Naomi wondered if Heather had truly learned anything from this. Maybe she had. Maybe, in the quiet aftermath of losing her job, she had been forced to reflect, to understand that her prejudice had cost her a career. Naomi didn't wish her harm. But she was relieved that Heather no longer had the power to mistreat others the way she had tried to mistreat her. That was enough. A return to routine. The next time Naomi flew, the flight was uneventful, just how she liked it. As she sat back during a cruising segment, sipping a warm cup of coffee, she let herself smile at the memory of how fast things had escalated, and how swiftly justice had arrived once the right people had been made aware. Pilots often talked about situational awareness, the ability to assess all relevant factors to ensure a safe flight. And Naomi realized that, in life, situational awareness also meant recognizing injustice, and having the courage to push back against it. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Returning to the scene of the incident. A week later, Naomi found herself back in New York for another flight assignment. During a layover, she strolled through the same terminal where she had first encountered Heather. For a split second, the memory of that moment struck her. But now it felt different. The air was clear. No weight, no tension. She glanced around. Travelers of all backgrounds filled the corridor, parents hugging children goodbye, staff assisting passengers with warm smiles. Near the gate where it all happened, a new crew stood checking tickets and greeting passengers. There was no lingering hostility. Just the normal, steady flow of travel. Naomi paused for a moment, then touched the brim of her pilot's cap, a quiet salute to that gate. A symbolic nod to the battle she had fought here. Then, adjusting her cap, she turned and walked away, blending into the current of travelers moving forward. Because the future felt as wide and boundless as the open sky. Thriving in the skies. In the months that followed, Naomi continued to excel in her career. She earned a promotion, a higher-ranking captain position on prestigious international routes. Each new flight reminded her of why she had fallen in love with aviation in the first place. The discipline. The wonder. The camaraderie among those who shared a passion for the skies. She also stayed in touch with Linda, who was thriving in her new role at a regional carrier. One day she received a message from her. "I just wanted to say, thank you. Because you spoke up, I finally had the courage to leave an environment that didn't deserve me. I love my new job. The crew here? They respect me." Naomi smiled. She had fought for herself. But in the process she had helped others find their own strength too. And that made everything worth it. Naomi's formal complaint hadn't just shifted the course of her own career. It had opened her eyes to what true professionalism should look like. In her last message, Linda had put it plainly. "I always wanted to stand up for what was right. But watching someone do it, calmly, effectively, gave me the courage to walk away from an environment that tolerated prejudice." Time passed, and the entire incident became more than just a personal battle. It became a chapter in Naomi's broader journey. A reminder that sometimes, adversity is what paves the way for awareness and change. Giving back to the next generation. Once a month, Naomi volunteered at a pilot outreach program for youth. Standing in front of a lecture hall, she spoke to young aspiring aviators, kids with wide, eager eyes, about overcoming doubt, about the discipline of flight school, and yes, occasionally about the injustices she had faced. She never framed herself as a victim. Instead, she made sure they understood. The sky is open to all, so long as you believe in your abilities and stand firm against anyone who tries to clip your wings. The words resonated. She saw it in the way the students leaned forward, hanging on to every word. She saw it in their determined expressions, in the way some stayed behind after her talks to ask questions, to share their own dreams of one day sitting in the cockpit. And that, more than anything, reaffirmed to Naomi that she had done the right thing. A conversation that meant everything. One early morning, just before a flight to Tokyo, Naomi found herself in the crew lounge, sipping her coffee as she reviewed the flight plan. Nearby, a group of newly hired flight attendants flipped through manuals, prepping for their first big overseas assignment. She recognized the excitement in their eyes, the nervous energy, the eagerness to prove themselves. Then one of them, a bright-eyed recruit named Gabriella, glanced up and caught sight of Naomi's captain's stripes. Her eyes widened. "Captain Ellison?" she asked, hesitant but excited. "I read about you in an article. You're the pilot who stood up against discrimination on another airline, right?" Naomi paused, not expecting the reference. But she nodded. "That was me." Gabriella's face lit up. "It made me realize how important it is to speak up. My own cousin went through something similar, and we were too scared to file a complaint. But after reading about you, we did it. Together." Naomi felt something deep shift in her chest, a mix of humility and gratitude. She had never sought recognition. But knowing that her story had given someone else the courage to speak up, that meant everything. She met Gabriella's gaze and smiled warmly. "I'm glad you did. Sometimes, it just takes one story to inspire others." Gabriella nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "Thank you, Captain." The ripple effect. Moments like that reminded Naomi of why speaking up mattered. The memory of Heather's hostility? Fading. In its place, a new generation of aviation professionals, pilots, flight attendants, and crew members who valued respect and accountability, was rising. And that was what mattered most. Naomi adjusted her captain's hat, took one last sip of coffee and stood. It was time to fly. Because no matter how much had changed, the sky was still hers. And she wasn't going anywhere. A beacon for change. Naomi felt a deep sense of closure, not just from the resolution of her own ordeal, but from the realization that her experience had become something bigger. What had started as a single, ugly incident had transformed into a symbol, a reminder that silence in the face of discrimination was no longer an option. A year of flight and purpose. Over the next year, Naomi's career continued to thrive. She crisscrossed continents, touching down in cities she had once only dreamed of flying to as a child, standing behind that chain-link fence, watching the sky. With every takeoff, she reminded herself, the journey toward true equality is ongoing. Some days were smooth. Others came with turbulence, subtle biases, lingering doubts from those unwilling to accept change. But just as a plane must push through rough air to reach smooth skies, Naomi knew that every battle fought, every injustice confronted, brought the industry closer to progress. Finding peace in doing what's right. The day finally came when Naomi felt entirely at peace with what had happened. Not just because Heather and those who enabled her behavior were gone, but because she had done what was right. She had stood firm. She had documented every fact. She had trusted in the power of truth and accountability. And the industry had responded. A statement had been made. Bias had no place in aviation. Discrimination would not be tolerated. Flying forward. And so, Naomi moved forward, not weighed down by what had happened, but empowered by it. She continued doing what she did best. Flying planes, mentoring others, inspiring the next generation to break barriers in the sky. Because it had never been about revenge. It had always been about integrity. The final lesson. She had once been denied a first-class seat by a flight attendant who thought she didn't belong. But with one decisive call and an unwavering commitment to standing up for herself, she had ensured that the ignorance and prejudice of that day would never take flight again. The horizon stays open. The sky remained wide and boundless. A testament to persistence. A reminder that dignity has no color, no assigned seat. It belongs to everyone who dares to dream. And has the courage to claim their place in the sky. Naomi was once denied a seat, not because she wasn't qualified, but because someone believed she didn't belong. But with one decisive call and unwavering determination, she not only reclaimed her rightful place, she also ensured that such discrimination would never take flight again. Naomi's journey is proof that persistence, integrity, and the belief in fairness can lead to real change. What do you think about this story? We want to hear from you. Backhand index pointing right. Do you think Naomi received the justice she deserved? Backhand index pointing right. If you were in her shoes, how would you have reacted? Backhand index pointing right. Would you prefer a different ending to this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you love meaningful, deep, and thought-provoking stories, don't forget to subscribe to Soul Deep Stories on YouTube. Headphone here, you'll discover real-life stories filled with emotion, courage, justice, and hope. Backhand index pointing right. Follow us now at Soul Deep Stories. Let's explore the stories that touch the heart and inspire change. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next story. Rocket Sparkles.